Hello. Bergson and the Holographic Theory of Mind, continuing series continued. This will be part 16, storing experience or not in the brain. So we'll be looking at current amnesia theories, an aspect of amnesia theories called Consolidation Theory, where memories are gradually consolidated in the brain. Connectionist models of consolidation, the hippocampus in the brain, and the latest update, shall we say, on these researches and theories in 2017 via MIT's findings. All of this will be taken in the context of Bergson and Bergson's theory and what current research and theory is actually saying relative, shall we say, to Bergson's model. So in Bergson's model, in Matter and Memory, Bergson discussed the results of his 5 years of examining then current memory research, particularly the phenomena of amnesia and aphasia. Aphasia examples would be damaged ability to recognize words or people or objects. I simply don't recognize the words of a language. I can't recognize a tennis racket as opposed to a fencing mask, etc. Damaged ability to understand number or metaphor or to draw. So it's not total amnesia of experience or events, past experience, but inability to recognize things. His conclusions were, there is no evidence that forces the conclusion that experience is stored in the brain. There are, in fact, many problems with this very notion. In fact, storage in the brain is merely an hypothesis. But it's an hypothesis exalted to a scientific dogma. So what he's saying again is that we're storing my entire canoe trip, 2 weeks worth, in the brain. All of that experience is in reality not supported by the then current research up to 1896. But this notion is yet a dogma, scientific dogma, unquestionable. So, before any new viewers collapse in laughter at this notion that memory isn't stored in the brain, let us note, currently, there is no actual understanding in science on how experience is actually stored in the brain. All storage sites are just as equally now seen to be perceptual processing sites. As noted, this is precisely because there is no actual theory of perception that is of experience, or as I've dubbed it, the origin of the image of the external world in the first place. In The Future of the Brain, a recent book, the neuroscientist authors discussing the planned massive programs that will attempt whole brain emulation, trying to piece apart what the brain does neuron by neuron, noted exactly this. A huge weakness in this effort is going to be the fact that we have no idea, no theory of how experience is stored. So to move on. To recap, Bergson argued that inability to remember past events does not mean that memories stored in the brain have been damaged. There's an equal implication. The ability of the brain, serving as a reconstructive wave, passing through the external holographic field, this ability to assume the complex modulation patterns required to retrieve past events has been damaged. It's not that the experience has been lost. So in this view, amnesia is a retrieval problem. It is not a storage problem, that it is not damage to stored in the brain experience. And I would note that there has been a long debate in memory science. Is amnesia a retrieval or a storage problem? However, the retrieval in this side of the debate is construed as a problem of dragging stuff out of brain storage sites. But just saying, already a storage problem is not a given. It is seen, at least on one side of the debate, as still a retrieval problem. And that is an index that things may not be what it seems. Now, I'm going to extend Bergsons model a bit. We're going to extend the concept of retrieval. I think is perfectly in line with Bergson's theory. What I'm noting is that amnesia is due to damage to the concrete dynamics underlying explicit memory and the symbolic function. It is not due to destruction of experience stored in the brain. As I noted in part 5, it requires children roughly 2 years to develop explicit memory and the ability to symbolize, or what I'm terming the symbolic function. And I noted that this was described in detail by the cognitive development theorist, child's development, Piaget, who termed the explicit the localization of events in time. It takes 2 years to develop this ability, and I'm talking a concrete brain dynamics as concrete as that of an alternating current motor. So a key event, really the birth of the symbolic and explicit memory in Piaget, was the little event where Jacqueline, his 19-month-old daughter, picks up a blade of grass, which she puts in a pail, as if it were one of the grasshoppers a little cousin brought her a few days before. And she says, "Tatel," or sauterelle, which is grasshopper in French. "Tatel, jump boy," her cousin. And so there's Piaget, that is Homer taking the role of Jacqueline there, seeing the grass and remembering the grasshopper. And Piaget says, in other words, perception of an object, which reminds her symbolically of a grasshopper, enables her to evoke past events and reconstruct them in sequence. And this ability took some time, nearly a couple of years, to develop. So there's implications in this. First one, to achieve the explicit, the ability to consciously localize events in the past, we have a complex organization achieved by a self-organizing dynamic system, namely the brain, which requires 2 years. But equally, it is an achievement, a complex organization, therefore, that can be clearly disrupted, say by a lesion, by a knock on the head. Implication 2, disruption or damage to this organization underlying explicit memory implies the unitary cause for amnesias. That is, the same cause, namely the loss of the ability to underpin the explicit and the symbolic function, the same causes behind retrograde amnesia, where previous experience is lost, and anterograde amnesia, where all subsequent experience is lost. So again, in retrograde amnesia, we have a damage event and all previous experience is destroyed, quote unquote. Or in anterograde amnesia, we have a damage event and then all subsequent experience is destroyed, but I can remember my previous experience. Vice versa for the retrograde. I can remember subsequent experience, but not previous experience. That supposedly is the nature of phenomena, retrograde versus anterograde. The third implication is that the gradient of retrograde amnesia should be flat. So there would be no limited RA, which was, say, the loss of, say, just a previous of 2 years of memory prior to the damage event. There would be no graded RA, which is to say increasingly more memories the deeper you go into the person's past prior to the damage event. So graphically, in graded RA, we have the damage event, say roughly age 50, but then the memory improves as one goes back into the past. One remembers more and more events, say from ages 10 to 20 than one does from ages 20 to 30. And in limited RA, we have the damage event, again, roughly age 50, and virtually no memories for just 2 years previous, and then pretty normal memory all along the age range as we go into the past. So we're saying the gradient should be flat, which is to say it kind of looks like this. We have the damage event, and there's really no gradation or no sudden loss of just 2 years previous. And that line would, of course, would be a little lower than what might be a normal amount of memory or ability to remember events. The yellow line there would be maybe a normal level, and you have in reality a general reduction of ability to remember due to the damage to the mechanism underlying the explicit memory, the dynamics underlying the explicit. Now the flatness should really be taken as a ceteris paribus, or all things equal condition, as though nothing else happens in life to affect the original memory. But in fact, a whole lot happens. We tend to revisit or relive some experiences, and so we get multiple copies, as we shall see, as it's called. And this, as we shall see, is likely what causes the graded memory phenomenon. In truth, we'll never quite get no graded memory phenomenon, but we'll get, as a result of the damage, a lowering of that graded level. We won't remember quite as much, as we'll soon see. But to level set, damage on a very large scale to the brain, there was going to be certainly both retrograde and anterograde RA. That is, you're going to have loss of previous events to the damage and inability to remember subsequent events after the damage. There will be no limited RA, not just 2 years lost, but there's going to be a whole large degradation across the scale of time. And there's going to be no graded RA. That is, there won't be improvement as we go deeper in time. Even there'll be a general loss, period. In a case where we saw this nuclear destruction in the famous HM, where Scoville removed large portions of his brain in 1956, HM lost all access to his previous experience and to any experience after the surgery. He could not remember ever having seen the experimenters even the very next day. They came in on Tuesday, they worked with them, they had him practice mirror tracing or whatever, and they'd come in the next day on Wednesday, and he had no remembrance of them ever having come at all. And this could go on day after day after day. Clive Waring, another case, large damage, was even worse than HM. One could put a candy bar in front of Clive, and then cover it up, and to Clive, it no longer existed. His memory scale was that short. He didn't even remember that it was there a minute ago. To Clive, every day was as though it was the first day he had ever lived, by his own accounts. So in what follows, we're in a way talking about arguments, discussions over the implications of much lesser damage. So the existence of extensive graded RA as opposed to limited is well supported. Brown, in a 2002 review of an extensive number of studies, showed this conclusively. The above graph shows the performance on remembering both events in people taken across decades. So what we see is two lines, one for amnesic patients, the absolute line, the lower line, and one for control patients, that is undamaged normal people. Notice that even normal people have what's graded amnesia, so to speak. They tend to remember more events the deeper one goes into the past. In this case, from the trauma line for the amnesics, from the trauma point. As one goes -1 decades, then -2, then -5 decades or 50 years into the past, the amnesic patient is remembering more and more events, but so is the undamaged control. So we're kind of back to that, what's the cause of that question that we've noted. And this is true, it should be noted, for semantic memories as well, which is curious. Or semantic memories, as we'll discuss later, are defined as facts and knowledge about the world. That is, I know that President Trump is the president. I know that St. Paul is the capital of Minnesota. And nevertheless, I'm kind of getting graded RA for semantic memories. And as I noted, we've got this graded phenomena even for normal people. So these curves confirm what is termed the Ribot effect, following the tenet of Ribot from his 1881 book, which Bergson was quite familiar with, namely that in the dissolution of memory, the new perishes before the old, advancing from the stable to the unstable. So the more recent event, or more recent the event, the newer the event, the less stable it is, and the more likely it is to disappear. So in the graphs there, the events at -1, for example, are much newer, and therefore less stable than events at -2, and then at -3, etc. To quote Ribot, it begins with the most recent recollections, which, lightly impressed upon the nervous elements, rarely repeated, and consequently having no permanent associations, represent organization in its feeblest form. It ends with a sensorial, instinctive memory, which, becoming a permanent and integral part of the organism, represents organization in its most highly developed stage. So note here, the rarely repeated, that is, repetition is being pointed to as a cause of the embedding of these memories, whatever repetition might mean, because it could be simply reliving the event over and over, from normal reliving to even some form of psychotic reliving, to simply having done the event over and over many years, that is driving to the same work office at the same desk with the same people over and over for years. So this repetition, of course, tends to seemingly embed the memory in some way. And And so we're dealing with this factor creeping into this whole discussion. So something there is about memory or experiences and years going by. And this has been termed in the memory literature consolidation, as though the original memory is being consolidated over the years. Consolidated, embedded ever more deeply, as though a nail hammering that memory, being hammered in by a hammer, the memory being the nail. Now, Brown suggests that this be interpreted as a progressive reduction in fragility as opposed to being pounded in with a nail. But as we shall discuss shortly, the standard version of this strengthening, until recently, has the experience ultimately stored in the areas of the cortex which were originally involved. So my coffee cup there is being processed by various cortical sites for auditory perception, visual perception, kinesthetic perception, and then that event is being stored there. And the hippocampus, located in the temporal lobe, is thought to be updating these cortical sites. The hammer being the hippocampus, driving the memory nails deeper and deeper into the cortical sites via a consolidation process over time. This process is also termed long-term potentiation, or LTP. That is, there is some notion of a chemical strengthening. Again, note, this is all under the notion that it's the same original memory, that coffee stirring, that one event right there being stored and then hammered in. But note, looking out there is the confusing factor about repetition of the coffee event or reliving the coffee event, and therefore simply adding more and more memories of the same type to those cortical sites. Just a warning. So just what this consolidation actually is has become an issue, as we shall discuss. A difficulty for the notion that it is destruction to these consolidated memories that is responsible for amnesia is the fact that cases are reported in which memories apparently return gradually in the reverse order of Ribot, from oldest to finally youngest. So always that's been a disconcerting factor, that, well, if the problem is really destruction to memories in cortical sites, how do they magically come back? Obviously a problem and one of long standing. Further, in an embarrassment to the consolidation theory, there's studies and experiments and cases that seem to show that the hippocampus would have to be driving this consolidation process for years, for all events ever experienced with no limit. And so it's been very difficult to place a limit on how long the hippocampus drives that consolidation process in the cortical sites. The existence of temporally limited RA, so back to the limited RA, has become increasingly questioned. Warrington and Weiskrantz already suggested that the duration of RA may be underestimated, that memory deficits may extend throughout the amnesiac's entire existence. And citing findings of Warrington and Sanders, 1971, that remote memories in older subjects, 70 to 79, were not selectively preserved. They argued for a unitary functional disorder. Again, remember this was the working hypothesis that explicit memory really involves a unitary, or destruction of explicit memory implies a unitary degradation, unitary cause of a degradation across the board, and that which could account for both anterograde and retrograde effects. And based on his 1997 work, Weisskranz still held this position, namely that any memory task that requires what he termed the past by present product, it is correlating a present event with the past event or a present situation with a past event, it is explicit memory, is seen as being at risk, as we saw in part 5. So in other words, Weisskranz is pointing to this general dynamic of past by present correlation or explicit memory as being the cause of amnesia, and this would be running across the board. I mean, by across the board, I mean all the way through the years, we would see this degradation as a result of this degradation to the fundamental dynamic underlying the past by present product. So again, Nadel and Bourbeau in 2001 voiced similar reservations. Again, in the consolidation view, the hippocampus is only temporarily critical. It should be. That is, it should just go away. If we wait for a sufficient interval for consolidation to complete, then lesion in the hippocampus, just remove the hippocampus, there should be no effect on memory. That those cortical sites should be nicely embedded by the consolidation process that the hippocampus drove. But the existence of graded RA, where the memory can be destroyed if the lesion is performed soon after the experience, but appears to remain if the lesion is done at a later period, has been taken as the strongest proof of this consolidation model. But Nadel and Bourbeau argued that studies in fact show that degraded memory performance again exists at all points in time. That is to say, we don't get this differential effect where if I remove the hippocampus, then the memory is nicely locked in there, nailed in there. No, I can show that in reality, memories are always affected by this damage, again, across the board. Another example, consider Cuvier et al. In 1999. They used rats for doing a spatial task, such as learning a maze. And once they'd learned the maze, they were given a long interval before subsequent surgery which removed their hippocampus. So in theory, they should have been given enough time for the hippocampus to perform its consolidation magic, acting as a hammer, nailing in those memories, that memory of how to do that maze. Now note we're talking kind of a performance memory, a procedural memory of making one's way through that maze here. Another problem we'll see that confounds issues. So the rats appeared to still perform well in that spatial task, making it appear that consolidation had been achieved and that the hippocampus was indeed no longer necessary, the cortex and those nicely nailed in cortical sites having taken over. But it was discovered that in fact, once one looked more closely, the rats were performing quite differently. The rats were in fact not using an integrated or map-like representation of the environment. Rather, the rats without a hippocampus fell back on what they termed a vector-like system that can support considerable spatial behavior, but lacks the flexibility of the hippocampus-supported maps. So they weren't able to get around nearly as easily. And I will note, spatial mapping seems to be one clear function of the hippocampus, that is forming cognitive or spatial maps of one's environment. And one's reminded of Cuvier's observations we saw in part 5, I believe, on observations of the aphasic that could not draw a room. Remember, he had to be shown where he was, the X there in that room, where the little yellow figures are desks and chairs, etc., for him to be able to draw that room with the furniture in it. And this again was a qualitatively different form of memory, both for Cuvier and for Nadel and Bergson and their rats. And they argued that this form of cortex-embedded memory may take longer to form. In the human realm, Squire reported for a patient with extensive medial temporal lobe damage or hippocampal damage that in retrieving autobiographical memories from early life, quote, neither the quantity or quality of his recollections can be distinguished from those of controls. So in other words, they were arguing that deep memories were nicely preserved, this sort of limited RA, in other words, happening for the memories formed recently. But then along come Rosenbaum et al. After examining KC, another amnestic patient with similar damage, and they showed that there were persisting deficits in some aspects of his spatial and autobiographical memory across the board again. So again, we're just not finding this limited RA. So assuming the questionable existence of limited RA, again, driving us toward this more unitary cause, and before examining the meaning of graded RA a little bit more, let's turn again to the theories of hippocampal function. So many theories have recently centered on the proposed role for the medial temporal lobe in memory, which includes the hippocampus and associated structures. As one can see there in the diagram, we've got the hippocampus as part of the medial temporal lobe, with the hippocampus including the areas DG, CA3, CA1, subiculum, the temporal lobe involving the rhinal cortex, and that whole system communicating with the various areas of the cortex, the auditory cortex, visual cortex, somatic cortex, and feeding both ways, in and out, which is why, of course, we're talking about the hippocampus driving memories, pounding nails back into the cortex. Because as a structure, the hippocampus receives input from nearly all regions of the cerebral cortex, and then sends return loops back out to the original sending area. So it's tempting to visualize this structure as a central station into which trains of present information flow, then to be directed back again into the great past holding storage areas of the brain. Of course, remember, as I noted in the very beginning slides, we've never been able to determine what's actually just a past storage area, because those areas in the cortex up there are also perceptual processing sites. Another problem lurking around. Burgess et al. Note the origins of this concept in David Marr, one of the premier computer theorists of vision. To quote them, a strict interpretation of its principal motivation, that the hippocampus acts as a temporary store from which all information is transferred into neocortical long-term memory, remains unsupported by convincing experimental data to this day. And this continues into 2017. So according to this conception, destroying this structure stops the flow of events into long-term storage. In other words, the flow is stopped back into those areas of the cortex, auditory, visual, somatic, etc. Now, the hippocampal literature is extremely complex, vast, and confused, and with multiple variables lurking around, and preconceptions and metaphysics. Some theories, for example, Eichenbaum, a large discussion in premier journal, Behavioral and Brain Sciences, it's in '94, see the hippocampal area as a type of intermediate memory, or a holding or buffer area, which retains events slightly longer than short-term memory, another mythical area, until they are stored, the events, that is, in long-term memory areas, or LTM areas. So it's an intermediate between short-term memory and long-term memory. But the purpose of this holding area is ultimately and inexorably linked to a time-binding function in these models. And time binding is going to tell us that we're going to jump right into the old classical metaphysics. So Kesner argued, in commentary on this article, that the hippocampus is an integral component in memory for duration and temporal order of events. Duration, that is, requiring the relation of beginning and endpoints of an event over time. And temporal order, requiring comparisons among events to establish their ordering in time. So a rat with hippocampal damage cannot perform a task like a maze, a radial maze, that requires memory of the temporal order of spatial locations. And HM cannot relate one mirror tracing event in order with another. Remember, he loses all track of an event on day 1 in relationship to an event on day 2 and then to day 3, nor even with respect to any previous events in his history. And Eichenbaum et al. Stated, in effect, that this time-binding role exists in seeing the hippocampal function as abstracting relationships between the current event and previous events. So abstracting relationships between the current event and previous events, whatever those relationships might be, other than the relationships of time, that this event is prior to that event, and vice versa. Squire spoke of a hippocampal role in maintaining the coherence of an event across multiple memory sites for content, note content, place, and time. So the content of event, which is be the dynamics of coffee stirring, the place where I did it at, that is at home, and the time that I did it in 2017, in the context of memory consolidation processes. So these consolidation processes that the hippocampus is driving are helping to maintain the content, place, and time, or the coherence of an event. So at this, we've got to call time out. Take establishing the duration of event, that is, establishing and holding and maintaining the events beginning and end points. I mean, really, are you really going to rely on the hippocampus to be the sole support of the time-extended rotation of a rotating cube or of the stirring coffee? I mean, are you somehow maintaining the beginning and end points of this event? And that would imply then you're maintaining all the intervening points of time of this coffee stirring or cube rotation or any other dynamic event we can imagine. I mean, can one actually imagine the memory model this would require? See, this is simply the utterly unanalyzed and essentially unconscious metaphysic, with its time, quote unquote, as merely a series of discrete instants. And the instants are such that they must be somehow held, glued, or related together, else the event disintegrates. It disintegrates from its beginning all the way onto its end point, and somehow it's got to be glued together. There is an underlying metaphysic going on in this entire discussion on the role of the hippocampus, and this is just one obvious instantiation thereof. Again, this is just pure avoidance of Bergson's temporal metaphysic. It's avoiding the concept of the indivisibility or non-differentiability, an equal statement of motion or flow. Or more correctly, it's just ignorance thereof. At Squire's maintaining the coherence of an event for content in its cortical sites. Again, really. So have you actually split up the ongoing coffee stirring into components? And now you're asking the hippocampus to hold this dynamic, once ongoing multimodal event. By multimodal, I mean kinesthetic, auditory, visual, all of the forces and dynamics involved in that coffee stirring together. You're holding all that together via this consolidation process that the hippocampus is now responsible for. And that is stored in these cortical sites in its actual four-dimensional extent and in its multimodality. Same. Then there is establishing the temporal order, quote unquote, which requires, quote unquote, comparisons among events to establish their ordering in time. But when does this start? I mean, what is an event to these theorists? Again, is the hippocampus required to maintain the temporal order of the coffee stirring, or the rotating cube, or the falling leaf? Yes, as we saw in part 5, establishing order in time is related to explicit memory, as we saw. But explicit memory is, again, a subject virtually unexamined by these theorists. We saw that Piaget's children learned to order the flow of water when the water was broken up into a series of discrete events, pictures of various levels of the flow from one beaker into another. And they learn to order that. Or I can learn to remember an order that I get out of bed, I've gone to work, I do things at work, and I come back again. This is all part of explicit memory and ordering events in time. Just as Jacqueline can begin to remember playing with a grasshopper yesterday by looking at a piece of grass today and ordering that present event in time to that past event yesterday. But this is explicit memory, and it's quite a different subject than what these people are conceiving of. Yes, there are likely orders of complexity in the instantiation of cost, remember causality, object, space, and time, and the symbolic, where we go from the rat with a very low, virtually pre-wired form of this ability, to the ape, which is more sophisticated and even with a very limited linguistic ability as a result of this cost slash symbolic ability, all the way to the human, from rat to human to ape, rat to ape to human. But time binding or abstracting relationships between the current event and previous events, or maintaining coherence for content, place, and time, to quote these people, are either on a shorter scale, ignoring the ecological, time-extended multimodal events like coffee stirring, or on a longer scale, serving in effect as shorthand phrases for the endpoint of the explicit slash symbolic trajectory and the achievement of the ability thereof that we reviewed in Piaget. This warns us that the framework in which the function of the hippocampus is viewed must be considerably expanded and, unfortunately, looked at with far more analytical acumen than is being used currently. And again, we know, even in the best of scientific circumstances, in trying to understand the role of the hippocampus, we know very well that we're in the classic situation of destroying a component in a complex device such as a radio, and then trying to infer, either from a dead or badly functioning radio, what function the component might have performed. Where, in this case, the hippocampus is a vacuum tube, and we're trying to figure out what that vacuum tube did from a now badly functioning, if at all, radio. So this is not a trivial task. And so Fuster noted in the same discussion, which was a quite interesting discussion about the hippocampus, quote, neither Rollins nor these authors, Eichenbaum being the main author that was being commented on, however, seems to have taken note of the fact that their relational role in the time domain, remember they were talking about establishing relationships among events, is practically identical to the role that this commentator, Fuster in 1980 and 1985, earlier attributed to the prefrontal cortex. Perhaps we are dealing with the same memory processing function at different levels of the representational hierarchy. The cross-temporal binding role of the prefrontal cortex would take place at a higher, more cognitive level and broader schemes of memory than that of the hippocampus. The time-binding function of the prefrontal cortex derives from its representational function, that is, from the role of this cortex in representation of temporal gestalts, plans and programs of motor actions. So what we saw there was pointing to the prefrontal as actually being the mechanism in the brain, the system in the brain that is driving explicit memory. That is the resultant, the development of that is the resultant of this trajectory that takes 2 years and longer. And Fuster was pointing to the role of the prefrontal in driving the explicit memory of events like the grasshopper. Therefore, for human amnesia, it's being argued that the prefrontal cortex is that which is critical, and that this is likely what is being developed during the 2-year trajectory, underlying explicit memory, cost, and the symbolic. And in amnesia, it is explicit memory that is the problem. The hippocampus studies, as we shall see, are virtually never dealing with explicit memory. They're rather focusing on T-maze learning or maze learning, or a light appears and then an electric shock follows, and the rat's supposed to learn that the light means bad things, electric shock is coming. Or discrimination learning, where the rat's supposed to learn that if he presses on a button that represents a triangle, he'll get a hamburger as opposed to the square there, discriminate between the triangle and the square as that which leads to the hamburger. So how does the hippocampus actually play in this overall dynamic which involves the prefrontal supporting explicit memory? That is the actual confusing question. In other words, how does it, in my picture there, how does it relate to the whole system? How does it take part in a larger system that involves and supports explicit memory? In one view, the hippocampus is simply failing to do its part in a larger scheme orchestrated from the prefrontal cortex, as Fuster was sort of indicating, a view that appears to have become actually kind of a consensus. Warrington and Weisskranz speculated also that it is a disconnection between the medial temporal lobe structures and the prefrontal cortex that precipitated the amnesic or amnestic syndrome. And Chalice et al. In 1994 also proposed that episodic memory, or what we're calling explicit memory, involves frontal control of the hippocampus function. So we're looking at this larger system of which the hippocampus is a part. But again, when we actually unpack the phrase cross-temporal binding, I'm just pointing out here again, we're actually talking about cost, or the causality, object, space, and time underlying the explicit. Koppelman and Kapur, again in 2001, note that the subject's ability in prefrontal test is an important factor in recall. Further, they too note that the large frontal lobe lesions can produce retrograde memory loss. So I damage that component and I get retrograde memory loss too. So I think you see how the whole system and its operation is becoming the real question and is a huge factor in the confusion. So let's look at the connectionist models and discussion of this for a moment. So the connectionist models of the hippocampus have taken, or at least at one time, took point position in the theoretical attack. The standard or original form of these models views the cortex as the ultimate storage point of experienced events. Again, we saw that already. Cortex neurons, they argued, form association slowly. The hippocampal neurons associate patterns extremely quickly. The role of the hippocampus is to hold the pattern and feed it slowly over time to the various areas of the cortex that store aspects of the event. So note what's being said there. I'm looking at coffee stirring as my event with all its dynamics over time, its multiple modalities and its multiple dynamics, including adiabatic invariants, radial flow fields, inertial tensors, and all that is being held in the hippocampus somehow, and the hippocampus driving consolidation of this event back into the cortical sites, because for some rather ad hoc mystical reason, the cortex is slow and forms association slowly. And so once the link has gone away, hippocampus no longer is driving that link. Again, the memory is embedded in those sites. Again, they see the original event entirely stored in the hippocampus initially. So everything is stored there. The hippocampus is needed for a while until gradually the storage in the cortex is sufficient. And then the hippocampus somehow knows that storage in the cortex is sufficient. And upon damage to the hippocampus, this model implies short duration, temporally graded RA. recent events still held in the hippocampus or events not yet well consolidated in the cortex, also relatively recent, would be destroyed. Because if I remove the hippocampus in the consolidation process, therefore the weakly consolidated, not yet well driven in nails start to rust and or fall out. And however, well consolidated memories remain, and the better consolidated, the stronger the memory, thus supporting the famous Ribot curves, as we saw. And so in this conception, is the hippocampus involved in recall? Ultimately? Well, ultimately no, because the hippocampus goes away and only the cortical sites are relied on. But we've seen that the short-term temporally graded RA, the existence thereof is very questionable. And noting the little evidence for this form of RA, Nadel and Moscovich already in 1997 proposed a major alternative to the connectionist models, namely the multiple trace model. In this model, the hippocampus is needed for the retrieval of all memories, regardless of age. So the hippocampus yet acts as an index to the related cortical areas involved in the event. In this case, my coffee stirring. So it's an index. So that index in the hippocampus points to the visual flow field, all nicely stored in the visual cortex, all the auditory clinking going on in the auditory cortex. In the somatic cortex, I guess there would be all of the adiabatic invariances and the forces and dynamics, inertial tensions involved in that hand wielding that stir. And so that's a nice index to all that, and that kind of holds that whole event together, that index. But whereas the standard model ultimately sees the creation of an independent cortically based memory via consolidation, that is, we don't need that index, the multiple trace model sees repeated events creating redundant traces within the whole hippocampal complex. So the notion of the trace is always an amazingly mystical notion as well. There's this idea that in the neural structure there are traces, like I'll get more and more neurons. The more I experience various coffee stirring events, I'm going to get more and more neurons or traces or something in the hippocampal complex. And therefore, because I've got more of these traces, then older memories are more resistant to damage because there's more of them and they're more distributed. And therefore, if I damage one component of my or portion of my hippocampus, I've got other areas of it available with these memories. That's the idea. It's called, as I've failed to say here, the multiple trace model, competing with the connectionist consolidation model. So in this case, hippocampus involved in the recall of an event such as coffee stirring? Yes, as opposed to simply those cortical sites being the sites involved. So a neuropsychological study, Viscontis et al., on patients who underwent a unilateral temporal lobectomy or removal of the hippocampus showed extensive RA back to childhood. Again, that long graded RA. Nadel et al. Also demonstrated that in the model, the extent of the damage implies degrees of RA. Kind of as we began in the beginning, noting that if you get truly nuclear, you got major RA, and the less nuclear level of damage, the lesser the memory experience inability becomes. Again, the Rabo curves are supported. The greater the damage, the greater the RA, while the most resistant or better remembered events are indeed the oldest events. But again, we're going to have this lurking factor coming in, but I might have just relived those events over and over, or experienced the same kinds of events, namely riding my tricycle around the block more and more, many, many times. Now I have that yellow line there as simply showing a lower degree of memory. So the Rabo curves initially appear to pose a problem for a model of a unitary dynamic, such as cost, supporting all explicit memory. For one could ask why older events are explicitly remembered better than younger events if the same process is operative. If I've degraded the same general dynamic that underlies all remembering, why should some events still be remembered better than others? Now, however, we're beginning to see that there are at least two poles to the retrieval dynamic possible. And one would simply be the redintegration of the past experience in the first place. And the other is the dynamic involving cost, the symbolic, and the explicit. If the hippocampus is integrally involved in this retrieval process, and if indeed redundant traces of the experience facilitate the survival of some composite form of the event, and I'm simply talking some neural substrate that might be well formed because I repeat coffee stirring over and over again, then again there can indeed be graded performance on explicit memory. And as I've been threatening here all along, there are other factors playing in that are other possible sources contributing to the gradation. Again, if indeed the further we move along the past dimension, the more copies of a memory exist, then we equally and simultaneously are moving towards a semantic form of memory. The phrase coffee stirring is a semantic memory. And the terms copies of a memory and redundant traces here are denoting reliving or re-experiencing an event multiple times via different occasions, either of experience or recall. So it's hard to escape this simple factor of repetition and what neural substrate might be being laid down. Again, even in the example I gave long ago in the initial memory discussion of part 4, of playing Chopin's Waltz in C-sharp minor over and over again and laying down a motor memory as opposed to all the different experiences of practice sessions. So a new experience, or simply a reliving of that experience, still is equivalent to making a copy of the experience, and this terminology being used in the literature. And semantic memory has been proposed as a form of invariance defined over multiple episodic memories. For example, Rovio and Collier et al., or even myself. But however, Tolvien, a great memory theorist and the author of the term episodic memory, which is simply explicit memory of events, argued that the semantic cannot be invariance over episodic events because the very young child learns many semantic facts before he can explicitly remember past events. I'm simply taking the chance to notice that this is simply wrong when in the context of the development or the developmental dynamic underlying cost, causality, object, space, and time, the explicit and the symbolic. I mean, the fact that child cannot explicitly recall the events does not mean the events have not been stored, that he has not experienced all these coffee stirring events and can't ultimately form the semantic memory of coffee stirring. And most certainly does not mean that they have not been experienced, which is all that is required for this view of the semantic. That he might not be able to recall that he specifically stirred coffee when he was 2 years old and yesterday does not mean he did not, that the memory isn't there, as we've seen. Given the abysmal performance of the amnesiac on anything involving the past by present product, as Weisskranz called it, the semantic interpretation gains an even greater weight than the multiple trace model. The semantic interpretation, however, calls into question the notion that these curves represent an increasing amount of explicit memory along the past dimension at all. In other words, we may be simply relying on the fact that we've just embedded these events, so to speak, and made it easy to remember because they've been experienced so often. So to take stock, then, for a theory that sees explicit memory supported by the dynamic, this brain dynamic underlying cost, if we presume consonant with Foster's higher level temporal gestalts that the prefrontal area is a necessary component supporting this dynamic, we would then, as kind of in the consensus, have two major components or poles requiring an explicit retrieval: the hippocampal complex and the prefrontal. Damage to the hippocampal area. This still allows some basic reintegration. Memory can be haltingly supported. The Ribot curves can occur. So there's my damage to the hippocampal area. Damage to the prefrontal component supporting cost. I can still get reintegration. I may not have explicit memory thereof, of the event I reintegrated. I can still get priming, the phenomenon of priming, I believe I discussed in part 4. The past element of the correlation is available to be brought into play, the past, but the symbolic function required for its use in the explicit is unsupported. I cannot, if I'm Jacqueline, I can't remember that I had that experience with little cousin playing with grasshoppers when I see that piece of grass. I can't correlate the grass symbolically with the past event. So there's no explicit memory in this case. If I damage a critical component in the hippocampal area required for interaction with the prefrontal, I would have the same phenomenon as in my second point. There are many subtleties here. I'm painting a broad picture, enough to support a feasibility argument for the cost thesis, namely that destruction to the dynamic system, the concrete dynamical system that the brain formed over 2 years to support explicit memories, is the underlying factor in amnesia. I'm going to address one major question yet with respect to the possible independence of anterograde or retrograde amnesia, because my unitary model implies they cannot be truly independent. Destruction to either or both mast or poles, prefrontal or hippocampal, of the explicitship sinks explicit memory, both for events to be experienced and events already experienced. Whether anterograde and retrograde are in fact independent is a rather debated issue. Murray et al. Note studies that have shown that they are at least highly correlated. One case where there is truly independence is the result of cholinergic blockade. This results in severe anterograde with virtually no retrograde amnesia. So again, there's the ability to remember past events, but nothing future from the point where the cholinergic blockade was introduced. They argue, however, that this is likely undermining some system, perhaps the nucleus basilis, with its cholinergic inputs, which modulates the plasticity of the hippocampal neurons. But it could be equally said that given the hippocampal complexes involved in the ongoing perception of an event, that we would wonder what the nature of the perceived event is in the first place. Perhaps it isn't capable of normal redintegration, for recurrence of the external event with its inherent pattern or structure, to be discussed later a bit, simply does not evoke the same pattern as a now normal or non-blockaded brain. So in my little picture here, I'm perceiving the coffee stirring, and where I am got cholinergic blockade, or I'm CB'd, but that is not the same as not CB'd, where I'm perceiving the coffee stirring event, but I've now got, I'm normal. I mean, the perception of those two events could be quite different. So we're going to fast forward now to today. As you noticed, perhaps, most of my references end here around 2002. And in most of my research on this, which I did for my 2009 academic article on the cost of explicit memory, the fact is I just hadn't found much beyond that. The standoff between the consolidation and the multiple trace models simply continued with no great new results. Attesting to the reality of this static condition, not until 2017 do we see a study, in this case from MIT, billed as finally changing this stasis somewhat. The MIT researchers found that they could label neurons that they thought involved in specific memories, like an anxious event. So they could label with chemical labeling, shall we say, an anxiety neuron. We'll call it an anxiety neuron. And then they could stimulate them using light channeled down optic fibers, literally switching the neuron on and off to make it or them instantly remember the event. The question is, what do they mean by remember? They discovered that long-term memories develop at the same time as short-term memories, only stay quiet while they mature. This is contrary to the standard theory of memory consolidation, which says that you gradually transfers the memories, as we've seen. In this model, the memory is already there in the cortex. So to study how memories are made in mice, the team labeled memory cells in the hippocampus, the prefrontal cortex, in an area known to play a role in fear responses called the basolateral amygdala. The mice were then subjected to mild electric shocks in a situation intended to create a fearful event. The mouse was put in a particular chamber, and that chamber was the place where he got shocked. Just one day later, they were found to be forming memory networks in both the hippocampus and the prefrontal cortex. So in this case, my robot there is the fearful event, the particular chamber. And the mouse, once seeing it, has then applied an electric bolt in his butt and emits a grok, which is equivalent to freezing behavior. And so we'll go on from there. That's my symbology for this. Both of these networks, the prefrontal and the hippocampus, could be switched on to force the mouse to remember its ordeal. So I could switch on the prefrontal there, or I could switch on the hippocampus, either one, and I'm going to get the grok, or the freezing behavior, which is equivalent supposedly to a memory of being in that chamber or seeing the robot. But only the hippocampus cells activated in moments of what they called natural recall, or what I might call redintegration, because if I see the robot, then the hippocampus activated and I got the grok. The prefrontal wasn't involved initially. 2 weeks later, however, the situation was reversed. The hippocampus could be forced to work, and the freeze happened when hit with a pulse of light through their optical equipment there. But the mice no longer used them, that is the hippocampus cells, to remember, that is, in their remembering being freezing. So I turn on the hippocampus and I get the grok, but he's not remembering the robot. In natural recall, they activated only the prefrontal cortex, or long-term memory. So along comes the robot, and that reintegrates now the prefrontal cortex, and I get the grok, as opposed to the hippocampal spot two weeks ago. So now the prefrontal seems to have taken over. In other words, the two memories formed in parallel, but then they go different ways from there. The prefrontal cortex became stronger, the hippocampus becomes weaker. For the authors, more long-term studies are needed to see if the hippocampus completely loses all trace of memory after a while. And researchers will need better techniques to trace engrams for a longer period. The engrams being, in their mind, the place where the memory is stored in the hippocampus or the prefrontal. So, big question there, do they disappear in the hippocampus? So in this case, we have hippocampus involved in recall? Maybe not. There's also the question of how the long-term memory cortical cells mature. The exact mechanisms are unclear. The study showed that communication between the prefrontal cortex and the hippocampus is critical. Those arrows that we had once before between the two areas. Because blocking the circuit connecting those two regions prevented the cortical memory cells from maturing properly. So you have to have the connection between the two, at least for a while, or you don't get the cortical memories maturing properly, according to cortical cells maturing properly, according to the study. So hippocampus involved in forming memory, at least in the cortical areas? Maybe yes. Now, how to assess this? What is a memory in this study, firstly? Well, it's a pure physiological response. It's a conditioning. Remember, the mouse goes in the chamber and just and then gets zapped and exhibits freezing behavior. Now, no one, not Bergson for sure, is disputing some form of physiological or brain-based memory, so-called. It's not, however, like they're looking at hippocampal activity while watching coffee stirring. In this experiment, is this explicit memory? Most unlikely. Again, just a form of conditioning. I mean, we can imagine a robot with no consciousness and no explicit memory whatsoever being shoved into the chamber, or seeing the picture of the fearsome robot and being exhibiting what we might call a robotic freezing behavior. Explicit memory, consciousness involved? Nope. So this last topic, the involvement of the hippocampal complex in an ongoing event, raises some serious questions on the adequacy of our conceptions, as I've been hinting. Connectionist models such as McClellan and memory theory in general live in a static world. Time, particularly in the form of dynamic events, has not appeared yet on the horizon. To quote one set of theorists on memory, Mays and Roberts, events are experienced as a continuous series of linked scenes. Note, scenes, static, each made of several objects located in particular spatial positions. In other words, we're right back to what my favorite example is, Barcelona, with a biting transformation being stored as a series of schematic states. Mouth closed next to object, mouth open, etc. In other words, those three phases are three linked scenes in the Mason-Roberts terminology. All proceeds as if it's sufficient to theorize on how the hippocampus and or other structures might store some static event. Is a snapshot or a series of snapshots of a person with a spoon with stirring coffee, or simply a snapshot of an instant in a chamber, and then we get a freeze reaction. Further, current theory tends to hold not only that selective aspects of events are stored, but that only selective events are stored. Again, say Mason-Roberts, only a tiny fraction of experienced episodes are put into long-term storage. So there's my whole 2-week canoe trip there, but maybe all I store is some little slice of canoeing down the lake. There's, again, absolutely no principal theory as to how the brain makes such a selection, either of events or of aspects of an event, for that matter. For all intents and purposes, current memory theory appears to have given virtually no thought to the nature of the events that it is attempting to parse and store as slices in different areas of the cortex. I should add, it is no thought to the rich mathematics and transformational dynamics of event phenomenology. As I've noted multiple times, simple event like coffee stirring, we have inertial tensors, adiabatic invariants, radial flow fields, texture gradients and flows, acoustical invariants, and that's just the beginning. All of this is indeed involving multiple areas of the brain: visual areas, motor areas, auditory areas, haptic areas. The hippocampal area presumably is interconnecting with them all, as the picture shows, perhaps employing these intermodal invariants. Even the action goal of stirring must be supported by the prefrontal areas. Over these, we have a resonant feedback from the multiple oriented projections between all areas, which supports a dynamical pattern occurring over time. Notice again in the picture, all of these events are feeding forward and backward to each other. For practical purposes, we have a near global time extended pattern supported over the brain. The pattern itself, in some form, must support the ongoing invariant structure of the coffee stirring event, and or the translating rotating cube being specified in perception. We must wonder then, when looked at in this dynamic context, how much memorizing is actually going on in the hippocampal complex. Perhaps it has all it can do just to support the ongoing event. Where are the breaks in this dynamic flow where snapshot processing and storage could occur? To say the whole event, as per McClellan et al., is stored in the hippocampal area is extremely problematic, in fact, impossible. The static features which comprise connectionism's vectors do not exist in an instantaneous cross-section of time. They are simply invariants over flows, as we've discussed. It is the flows supported globally over the brain and all the modalities of the event that would have to be reduced for storage in the hippocampus. Remember, we talked many times now about the concept that all these events are somehow reduced, abstracted, distilled, and then stored. But how? By what principle? Certainly some strengthening of neural connections is occurring if I see enough coffee stirring events and do enough. Yet if I represent this same event with the same invariant structure, say within the hour, I must expect that it will recreate roughly the same global dynamic neural pattern. I have the basis for redintegration without invoking or having any need for learned hippocampal connections. If so, and if my explicit memory dynamic is operative, we can achieve explicit recall. That is, of the previous time I saw the stirring, for both present and past are available for correlation. That is the present by past product of Weisskranz. Simultaneously, within the same hour, I damage the hippocampus. And if indeed it is integrally involved in the ongoing patterns of any present event, how could the same redintegrative pattern recur? The pattern and the event it specifies could no longer be supported. And a more dynamic event-based context will clearly cause reconsiderations of the function of the hippocampal complex. But suppose we can extend our connectionism to cover the reinstantiation of these dynamic time-extended patterns supporting flows and the invariant structure of an event over these flows. We are still left with the fundamental problem of the gap. We have reinstantiated a complex neural pattern, but have we truly accounted for the reconstruction of the past experience? How does the experiential image of the coffee stirring or Jacqueline's grasshopper again arise? Again, we have the symmetric problem to that of perception, where we cannot explain how the same global neurodynamics results in the perceived external image of a grasshopper in the first place. So without understanding this, I believe it questionable that we can grasp the past by present correlation underlying the explicit. In other words, we have to have a model of perception in the first place, which is what we've been discussing. So in summary, the extended Bergsonian thesis: amnesia is not due to the destruction of experience stored in the brain. It is a function of a general degradation of the concrete dynamics underlying explicit memory and the symbolic, which took 2 years to develop and more. Now, this is pretty well supported, at least implicitly, as we've seen, especially given those theorists noting the critical role of the prefrontal cortex in recall, and given the questionable existence of limited RA, and the strange near semantic status of the source of graded RA. It is the multiple trace model. In other words, given the support for a unitary cause. At minimum, nowhere do we see a proof or necessary inference that experience is stored in the brain. Rather, we see a science that is very, very far from any understanding or concrete theory. Again, in both recall and memory formation, the storage role of the hippocampus is, shall we say, murky, very murky, especially given the classic metaphysic in which the research works. The extremely impoverished view of events employed in this research, the dogma of storage that guides / conditions both research and conclusions. So I, for one, find myself always saying, well, what if you had taken a quite different view? What if this dogma of storage wasn't there? What if you were looking at actual events with dynamic structures? What if, I mean, the unanswered questions are so frustrating in this research, I cannot begin to tell you. So in truth, this has been a very limited discussion of Bergson and memory. I've just focused here on amnesia theory and hippocampus, and even here, very limited. Chapters 2 and 3 of Matter and Memory contain a wealth of alternative theory versus current thought and research. That is, in Matter and Memory, you can take these chapters and play them against current ongoing thought and research, and have a speculative and analytical field day. There's the subject of memory dissociations I'd mentioned, other aspects of his view on failures to retrieve visual and auditory images in these problems, memory thought problems. His theory of recognition memory, his views on free recall, his theory on aphasias, and even more on amnesics versus simple tasks like paired associate learning, their implications are in there. So in my humble opinion, once we abandon the computer model of the brain, and I should say the classic metaphysic, this thought will be the guide. But I'm coming to see I probably have to do a part B here to discover, to deal with, I think, some of those things in those sub-bullet points that I think are necessary to look at also. So there's one more thing I have to add. In reviewing this, I see one more definitely untied string. Throughout this runs the theme, namely events are constantly being repeated, or as memory research likes to term it, copies are being made. Whether this is the simple repetition of coffee stirring event after coffee stirring event which we experience, whether it be reliving an event mentally via past recall, nevertheless, we're repeating this event within the brain, or something's being repeated in the brain relative to the event, and something then seems to be happening in the brain, some sort of neural modification. And this seems to be having an effect on memory. It seems to be causative of the Ribot curves, where I tend to remember more events the deeper we go into the years, into the past. More events from 40 to 50 years ago than from 20 to 30 years ago. And it seems to be a function of the repetition of events. These events becoming more resistant somehow to brain damage. So yes, this seems to be a critical question. That is, what is the relation, the interaction between the memory, as we like to call it, stored in the brain, and our four-dimensional experience, the true memory, which is not stored and cannot be so stored? What is the interaction? Why is it, one could ask, that events in the past seem to be retrievable and help along the explicit memory mechanism that is perhaps damaged, we think, my theory, in amnesia, that nevertheless operates a little bit better the deeper we go into the past? Just what is this relationship? What is the interaction? But current science cannot even ask this question, and it cannot do so until it ditches and buries its classic metaphysic. And we have to remember, it's this classic metaphysic that's the framework for forcing the concept that it is the brain that is entirely responsible for storing all of our experience. Remembering the logic being, the brain is matter. It is part of the material world, but by definition, the material world only exists in the present instant. And the brain, therefore, being matter in the present, must preserve the present instant before this instant fades into the definitional non-existence of the past. So this is driving everything we've been seeing in terms of the approach to memory research, and therefore all of the lurking problems, of which only a few we've actually explored in this entire approach. So down the road, I'm still looking at this whole philosophical subject of known as temporal consciousness, which is amazingly unknowledgeable about Bergson. The whole subject of deep learning versus Bergson, and as I've just sort of indicated, probably more on current memory research versus what's in Bergson. So next time I'm not quite sure. I guess it'll be a surprise. But till then, signing off.